A baby is lying on its back, staring at the ceiling fan, not glancing at it, not distracted by it, staring, with a kind of fixed, almost adult concentration that feels wrong for a face that young. The fan isn't even moving, and yet the baby tracks something invisible in the air above it, silent, completely absorbed, as if watching something the rest of the room cannot see. Most people walk past this moment. They smile. They assume the baby is just tired or curious or doing whatever babies do. But something else is happening here, something in the brain that isn't random, isn't coincidental, and isn't simply about ceiling fans. The common explanation goes like this. Early signs of autism are basically delays. The baby doesn't wave back, doesn't point, doesn't make enough eye contact. Parents are told to watch for absences, things that should be there but aren't. This is how most early screening works. It's built around the idea that development is a checklist, and autism means certain boxes go unticked. This explanation sounds reasonable. It's tidy. It gives parents something to look for. Until you look closer at what's actually happening in the brain during those first months of life. And then the checklist model starts to feel like a very incomplete map of a very complex territory. Here's what neuroscience has begun to reveal. In the first year of life, a baby's brain is doing something extraordinary. It's not just absorbing information, it's building a predictive model of the world. Every face, every sound, every touch is being cataloged not just as data, but as pattern. The brain is asking, constantly and unconsciously, what happens next? This is called predictive processing, and it's central to how human beings learn to navigate social reality. The brain predicts, receives feedback, adjusts, predicts again. Over thousands of repetitions, it builds an internal model of how the world, and especially other people, behaves. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In babies who later receive autism diagnoses, researchers have found that this predictive system doesn't fail. It works differently. It works, in some cases, with unusual precision. A 2017 study tracking infant brain activity found that babies who later showed autistic traits processed sensory information with a kind of heightened fidelity. Their brains weren't missing signals. They were registering more of them, and with less automatic filtering. Where a neurotypical infant's brain learns early to dampen down background noise, to prioritize the social signal of a face over the hum of a refrigerator, certain infants showed a more flattened hierarchy of attention. Everything registered, almost equally. This is where the ceiling fan comes back into focus. It's not that the baby is ignoring the parent in the room. It's that the fan, with its predictable rotation, its geometric symmetry, its reliable and non-demanding presence, is competing on equal terms with the human face, and sometimes winning. Because a face is unpredictable, a face shifts, changes expression, makes unexpected sounds, requires a response. A ceiling fan simply is. And for a brain that is processing the world without the usual social prioritization filters, that's not a small difference. The amygdala is involved here in ways that took researchers a long time to understand. For years, the assumption was that autistic individuals had an overactive amygdala in social situations, that social interaction triggered something like fear. But more recent research complicates this. What seems to be happening in some cases is not fear exactly, but something closer to sustained alertness. The amygdala isn't screaming danger. It's simply not quieting down the way it typically does when a familiar face appears. In neurotypical development, a caregiver's face becomes associated with safety through a complex interplay of oxytocin, repeated positive experience, and the brain's social reward circuitry. The face becomes, neurologically, a source of calm. But when that calibration is different, when the face remains unpredictable in a way that the brain hasn't fully modeled, the social signal doesn't carry the same regulatory weight. The baby isn't rejecting connection. The baby is in a brain that hasn't yet learned to find faces uniquely soothing. This is where it gets strange, because the behaviors that parents tend to notice, the unusual gaze patterns, the preference for objects over faces, the repetitive movements, these aren't malfunctions, they're adaptations. The infant brain, like all brains, is trying to regulate itself. It's trying to find patterns it can rely on. Predictability is, neurologically, a form of safety. And in a sensory world that feels less automatically filtered, a spinning wheel or a repeating sound isn't just stimulating, it's organizing. Researchers call this self-regulatory behavior. The brain is doing exactly what brains are designed to do. It's finding the inputs that help it reach a stable state. The difference is in where it finds them. And parents miss this not because they're not paying attention, but because they've been taught to look for deficits. They're looking for what's missing. What's actually happening is a different kind of presence. There's a concept in developmental psychology called joint attention, the ability to share focus on an object or event with another person, to essentially say with your eyes, "Look at this, we're experiencing this together." It emerges around 9 to 12 months in most infants, and its absence is one of the most reliable early indicators researchers track. But the framing of absence is worth questioning, because what joint attention actually requires is a brain that has already begun to model other people as separate minds with separate attention, and that is a deeply sophisticated cognitive achievement. It requires theory of mind to be in early formation. It requires the prefrontal cortex to have begun integrating social prediction. And it requires the dopamine reward system to have linked social engagement with something worth seeking. When this develops differently, it doesn't mean the capacity for connection is absent. It means the architecture of connection is being built along a different path. Here is the reframe, and it matters. Most people think of early autistic signs as the brain falling short of a standard, but what the research increasingly suggests is something more precise. The autistic brain, from very early on, is a brain that has not yet, or perhaps never fully does, apply the neurotypical shortcut of treating social stimuli as categorically more important than everything else. That shortcut is so deeply wired into neurotypical development that most people never realize it's a shortcut. They assume faces are naturally more interesting than fans, that voices are naturally more compelling than mechanical sounds, that other people are naturally the most important feature of any environment. But that preference is learned, it's neurological, and it's not universal. Which means the autistic infant isn't experiencing a lesser version of reality, it's experiencing a less pre-filtered one. This connects to something much larger about how human beings construct their sense of the world. Neurotypical cognition is, in many ways, profoundly social, not just in behavior, but in how reality itself is processed. The brain decides what matters largely based on what other minds seem to care about. This is efficient. It's also a kind of shared perceptual agreement. What early autistic development reveals is that this agreement isn't automatic. It's built, piece by piece, through neural systems that can develop along multiple viable paths. The social world isn't the obvious foreground of experience for every brain. For some, it has to be learned the long way, through explicit attention and repeated experience, rather than unconscious prioritization. And that process takes longer, which is why the window matters. Here is the thing most parents miss, not because they're not paying attention, but because no one frames it this way. The behaviors they're seeing in the first year aren't signs of a brain that's broken. They're signs of a brain that's working, just working without certain default social biases that most people take for granted. The baby staring at the fan isn't disconnected. The baby is deeply connected to something.
The question developmental researchers are still exploring is not why doesn't this brain connect, but what does connection look like when the social shortcut isn't the starting point? That's a different question, and it leads to different answers. There's something quietly profound in that. The infant who doesn't automatically prioritize faces is, in a sense, a reminder that the social world we all take as obvious is not, strictly speaking, obvious. It's constructed, it's learned, and the architecture underneath it, the dopamine loops, the oxytocin bonding, the amygdala calming at the sight of a familiar face, is more intricate and more fragile than most people ever have reason to examine. We assume babies come pre-oriented toward us. Most of them do, but that orientation is a biological process, not a given. And when it develops differently, what's revealed isn't an absence, it's the machinery itself, briefly visible,